Who will pick me up from the hospital? I texted in our family group chat as soon as I woke up after a major surgery. The replies came quickly, and when I read them, I felt a sharp sting. My son Adam responded, "Call a taxi. I'm watching the game." My wife Laura added, "Stay in the hospital for a month. It's so peaceful without you." It felt like a cruel joke. But little did I know, everything would change once I got home. Before they wheeled me into the operating room, life had been moving along like it always did. I'd always thought I had more time to take care of myself, but when I was diagnosed with serious heart problems, I realized I could lose it all in a single night. The heart surgery was inevitable. And even though I knew it was risky, I was willing to take that chance to live a few more years. Once the doctors told me I needed surgery, I decided to send a message to our family group chat. "Who will pick me up from the hospital after the surgery?" The reply came fast. Adam texted, "Call a taxi. I'm watching the game." Laura added, "Stay another month in the hospital. It's nice and quiet without you." I thought, well, this must be a joke. They just don't get how serious this is. But I was wrong. The surgery was scheduled for the morning. I went through all the necessary procedures and started to relax, thinking everything would be fine. The doctor had assured me everything would go smoothly. But then the time came when they put me under anesthesia. I had no idea what was about to happen. But when I woke up, I could hardly believe I was still alive. My heart had stopped for 47 seconds, and the doctors had managed to bring me back. I was alive, but the feeling was strange, and I couldn't understand how I ended up in that situation. The first thing I felt when I opened my eyes was excruciating pain in my chest. It was so intense that I couldn't even breathe properly. I couldn't sit up, and when I looked at the nurse who came to me, I couldn't help but ask, "What happened to me?" She looked at me with a slight smile and said, "You had a complex surgery, Mr. Martin. Your life is stable now, but it will take some time to recover. We'll need a few days for you to rest." I tried to make sense of everything, but all I could think about was how I'd nearly died, and not a single person from my family had bothered to check on me. It was horrifying to realize that I could have been gone, and they hadn't cared. There wasn't a single call or message from Laura or Adam, no words of support. Only emptiness. I felt my strength draining. Not because of the surgery, but because I was so alone at the hardest moment of my life. After a while, they handed me my phone. It was filled with notifications, none of which had anything to do with me: spam, ads, pharmacy reminders. I scrolled through, hoping to find something important. And at the very bottom, I saw something familiar: messages from Adam and Laura. But they weren't about my health. They were about something else entirely. Adam was complaining that his favorite juice wasn't at the store, and Laura was annoyed that I hadn't done more housework. No one wrote to ask how I was doing, no one called. It was cruel. I put the phone down on the table and stared at the white ceiling. It was too quiet. Too quiet. I tried to shut out the thoughts, but they kept coming back. My son didn't care about me, and my wife showed complete indifference, as if I was just a useless accessory in their lives. I was the person they could always rely on, but when I needed something, they didn't even notice. And that was the most painful part. It occurred to me that my entire life had been a series of self-sacrifices for others. All these years, I tried to please them, always being there when they needed something, ignoring my own needs. I thought they would appreciate it. But it turned out they just expected me to always be around and never thought about how I was feeling. While I lay in that hospital room, there was no one to show concern. And at some point, I realized that if I made it through this, maybe it was time to start living for myself. Maybe it was time to value myself, not just think about others. But that realization came too late to act on at the moment when I needed support the most. The day I was set to leave the hospital, I decided to check my phone one last time. Maybe someone finally wrote to me? But again, nothing. The screen was full of notifications, but no messages from Laura or Adam. About half an hour after I was cleared to leave, I received a message from Adam that I had been waiting for. But it was just like always. Call a taxi. I'm playing games. Laura texted. Stay in the hospital. It'll be better for you there. I couldn't believe my eyes. It felt like mockery. I had gone through surgery, almost died, and they couldn't even be bothered to ask how I was doing. At that moment, I knew it was time for a change. Time to accept that my sacrifices had gone unappreciated, that everything I had done for them was in vain. I made a decision: everything I had worked for in my life, everything I had accumulated, I would give away to charity. No more support from my family, no inheritance for them. I decided to leave everything I had to those who truly valued life. I was no longer willing to be the person they could just ignore. The surgery itself was like any other, but for me, it became a matter of life and death. When I closed my eyes under anesthesia, I had no idea what was ahead. I trusted the doctors, thought everything would go as usual. But at some point, right in the middle of the surgery, my heart stopped. For 47 seconds I was dead. And only thanks to the doctor's efforts, it started beating again. I was in that moment where the body hasn't fully gone, but hasn't come back either. And when I opened my eyes, it was hard to grasp what had actually happened. My heart had stopped, and I had died, albeit briefly. Waking up in the hospital room, I felt an excruciating pain in my chest. I couldn't immediately comprehend where I was or what had happened to me. The world around me was blurry, and the pain was sharp. I could hear the machines beeping, and the sterile hospital environment pierced my senses. I tried to look around, trying to understand what was going on, but everything felt like a muddled picture. When I first regained consciousness, the doctor explained that the surgery had been successful, but my heart had stopped. He spoke about it so calmly, as if it were just a regular procedure. I didn't know how to feel. I was grateful to be alive, but the realization that I had been dead, even for just a few seconds, deeply unsettled me. He said I'd need some time to recover. The doctors reassured me that I would be fine, but something inside me had shifted. As I tried to gather my thoughts and check on how my family was doing, I realized that I was surrounded by emptiness. My phone was filled with dozens of notifications, but none of them were from Laura or Adam. It was all reminders about chores, ads, and emails, but nothing about me, my condition, or my health. I scrolled through the screen, looking for any message, any call. But there was nothing. My family, in essence, hadn't even noticed that I had been at death's door. I was lying in a hospital bed, and none of them had shown any interest in what was happening with me. These moments hit me like a hammer. I had spent so many years giving my life to them, and when I was at my worst, when I was on the brink of death, I was left completely alone. The realization that I had become invisible to the people I loved hit me harder than any physical pain. I tried for a long time to figure out why this happened, but all I felt was emptiness and hurt. I didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear: I needed to do something that would change everything. My life could no longer continue in the same way if I was going to remain invisible to my family. I lay in that hospital room, feeling the weight of loneliness, and it became clear to me that if I got out of here, I needed to completely rethink my relationships with my loved ones. As the pain began to subside and I started to regain my senses, one thought lingered in my mind: I was alone. At that moment, when I was at my lowest, when I was on the brink of life and death, I felt a deep emptiness surround me. It wasn't the pain in my chest, it was something much deeper, something that no medication could heal. I had expected at least a word of support from my family, but instead, I was met with complete silence. No visits from Laura, no calls from Adam, not a single person who could show any concern for me. I was utterly alone in my experience. In my life, which I had dedicated to them, I had always believed that if I ever found myself in trouble, they would be there. But none of that happened. They didn't come, they didn't call, they didn't ask how I was. Instead, I received only empty notifications and a constant stream of messages that had nothing to do with me. At some point, I realized that I was no longer important to them. This realization came at the moment I lay in the hospital room. With each passing hour, the emptiness inside me grew deeper. I thought about my life, about how I had always tried to be there when my family needed something. I supported Laura when she had problems, I helped Adam with money and solving his difficulties. But when I needed help, they didn't even think to check in. I was just invisible. These thoughts gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. My situation became a metaphor for what was happening within my family. I wasn't their priority. The thought that I was only important to them when they needed something struck me hard. I had spent years caring for them, but now I realized that I was just a tool to them, not a person they truly loved. I had ignored my own problems and pain to avoid troubling them, to avoid burdening them with my issues. And now I was lying here, and all those years, which seemed so meaningful at the time, started to lose their value. I remembered how, just a year ago, when I had been feeling chest pains, I delayed going to the doctor. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to worry Laura. I didn't want to spend money on tests, and I didn't want to show that I was vulnerable. I told myself it was just aging, just fatigue. And in some ways I had deceived myself by ignoring the obvious. I thought that the most important thing was not to trouble my family, that they already had enough on their plate. I thought I needed to keep it all to myself and be strong. Now, I realized that was a mistake. I wasn't obligated to hide my problems, to deny myself help just to avoid causing worry. Now, lying on this bed, going through the painful recovery after surgery, I had no choice but to realize that ignoring my needs had led me here. I had given up, thinking that being strong meant sacrificing my own well-being. But in the end, I was left in isolation unwanted. The emptiness that consumed me was deeper than I had imagined. I thought that all those years dedicated to my family meant something. I had hoped that when I was in need, they would be there. But instead, I was left alone. In this hospital room, I felt that I had lost not just my health, but my self-respect as well. And now I was thinking, how much time had I spent on people who didn't appreciate my efforts? I had put their needs first for so many years, and now all I was left with was this sense of loneliness. If I make it through all of this, something has to change. I could no longer be the person who gave everything for others and received only emptiness in return. 2 long, painful weeks had passed since I was on the operating table. 2 weeks of pain, loneliness, and disappointment. During all that time, I hadn't received a single call from my family, not one message asking how I was doing. Laura didn't call, Adam didn't write. I waited, hoping that at least one of them would show a little concern for me. But it didn't happen. Every day spent in the hospital, I experienced not only physical pain but emotional anguish. The feeling of being invisible, utterly alone, grew stronger with each passing moment. I lay in my bed, surrounded by medical equipment, and began to realize that all those years I had devoted to my family had been in vain. I was just a means to an end, a tool, not a person to them. I had given them the best years of my life, and now, when I was in trouble, they couldn't even bother to ask how I was. The sense of betrayal was so overwhelming that I couldn't shake it off. I started thinking that it was time to change my life. I could no longer be the person everyone relies on in times of need, only to be forgotten when I needed help. This was an awakening moment. I realized it was time for change. After 2 weeks in the hospital, 2 weeks of isolation greater than I had ever experienced, I made my decision. I could no longer live for those who didn't appreciate my efforts. I decided that everything I had accumulated in my life should go to charity. I cut off my family from everything I had. They didn't deserve it. I was no longer willing to be their source of support, when they were incapable of showing care and attention in return. I decided to give all my property, all my assets, to charity. I wasn't going to leave a single cent to Laura or Adam. Everything I had earned, everything I had built, would go to something that truly deserved it, to help those facing heart disease, to research and support people who need attention and care. My family had never valued this, and I wasn't going to keep feeding them, continuing to be the one who forgives and forgets, who sacrifices himself for others. Once I made this decision, I felt a sense of relief. It was a tough choice, but it felt right. I knew my actions might cause shock and even anger, but I could no longer live hoping for support that would never come. I contacted a lawyer to begin the process of drafting my will. There had been times in my life when I put my family first, but now it was time to put myself first. I explained to the lawyer that I wanted everything I owned to go to charity. My house, my money, all my savings, everything should go to a cause that truly mattered. My family was excluded from the inheritance. I knew this decision wouldn't be easy for them to accept, but I could no longer live hoping for support that would never come. After meeting with the lawyer, I felt a heavy burden lift off my shoulders. I had finally taken the step toward independence, toward a life that would be for me, not for others. I was no longer going to be someone's shadow. I was ready to start anew, without looking back at those who had never truly valued me. After I made my decision, I realized I couldn't keep it to myself. I couldn't just quietly let things be as they were before, hiding my choice from everyone. I decided to share my story, not just to let people know that I had decided to donate all my wealth to charity, but also to make people understand what it's like to be ignored and forgotten by those you loved and supported your entire life. I sent my story to a few major news outlets, and soon it was picked up by the media. It wasn't just a report about me disinheriting my family. It was a story about a man who, despite all his efforts, had been cast aside in his own life. I shared about my surgery, how I was left to deal with my pain and loneliness on my own, and how that led me to decide to change my life and stop being someone who was taken for granted by those who ignored me. My story sparked a wide response in society. People sent me letters of support, telling me they had been through something similar in their lives, and how my actions had inspired them to make changes of their own. But the most interesting part came when my relatives started hearing about it. At first, they couldn't believe that I had really gone through with it. Adam texted me, demanding an explanation, trying to convince me that I should change my mind. Laura seemed completely shocked. She called me, not even knowing what to say. All she could offer were empty apologies, not backed by any real actions. But I knew that her apologies were just an attempt to avoid the consequences of her behavior. I saw how she tried to justify her apathy and indifference to what was happening to me. At first, they thought I would change my mind, that this was just an emotional outburst, but gradually they began to realize that I was serious. This wasn't just a statement or a whim. I had taken everything connected to my wealth and assets away from them. I felt how this certainty in my decision gave me strength. At some point, I realized that, despite their pain, I was doing this for myself. It wasn't just an act of revenge, but a way to take back my life so I would never be manipulated again. When they realized I was truly serious, they began to understand the consequences of their actions. Adam tried to meet with me, to talk, but I was firm in my decision. I knew their regrets were hollow, and came far too late. My life would no longer revolve around them. I had made my choice, and they had to accept it. I wasn't going back to a world where I was merely a tool for their benefit. The entire process was difficult. It was hard to watch them try to justify themselves, but I knew that these were the consequences of their behavior. I decided to no longer be their helper in any of their desires. My family began to realize that what I had done made far more sense than they could have ever imagined. A few months had passed since I made my decision and opened my life to change. During this time, I had managed to regain some composure, realize that this struggle hadn't been in vain, and that all the changes I'd made had become part of my new life. But at some point, it became clear to me that some things, like my relationships with my family, needed to be reevaluated. Adam started to change. It wasn't immediate, but at some point, he realized that his behavior toward me had been wrong. He found a job, something he should have done a long time ago. He rented a small apartment, which for him was a symbol of a new beginning. He came to me, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there for a long time, genuine regret. He said he understood how many times I had been there for him, and when I needed something, he wasn't. He realized his mistake, his passivity in our relationship, and now he was ready to fix things with me. When he came to me, I could feel how his words truly resonated. He apologized, said he would change, and that he would be better. It wasn't just empty words. I could see that his actions spoke louder than words. He had started to change his life, and that was clear. He wasn't the same person who always asked for something anymore. Now, he was ready to take responsibility for his life. I was ready to give him a chance. But at the same time, I understood that this didn't mean returning to the old dynamic because I was no longer the person who was fully involved in their needs. I had learned to be independent, and now the relationship had to be equal, without manipulation, without expecting me to solve their problems again. As for Laura, my wife, she remained the same. Despite the changes in me and my new outlook on life, she kept trying to manipulate me, justify her actions, and accused me of not giving her a second chance. She called, wrote, tried to convince me that everything that had happened was just a misunderstanding. She couldn't understand that I was no longer the person who would excuse her behavior just to keep the family together. I was no longer willing to play her game. Laura tried to make me go back to the way things were, but I knew it would lead nowhere. I realized she would always look for ways to use me, to justify her actions, but I was no longer going to be her tool. My changes weren't just external but internal as well. I couldn't be part of the world where my efforts weren't valued. I felt that, despite everything we had been through together, it was time to move on. She remained in her world, and I chose my path. Now, as I began to rebuild my relationship with Adam, I understood that this wasn't about returning to the old days but starting a new chapter, one that might bring new joys and disappointments. But with Laura, it was different. I couldn't be the one to hold her and their world together anymore. I finally understood that in order to move forward, I had to leave everything that didn't serve my inner peace behind. After I made the decision to change my life, each day began to feel more meaningful. It was as though I was reborn, freed from the weight of old obligations, old fears, and everything that had held me back in the past. And all of these changes became evident with every step I took toward a new world, a world where I was the priority. I started traveling, and it was truly eye-opening. All those places I had only dreamed of were now becoming a reality. I visited cities and countries I never thought I would see with my own eyes. Each new morning, each new place gave me a sense of renewal and lightness, something I had long been missing. As I traveled, I carried not only a backpack with my belongings but also my thoughts, which gradually became lighter and freer. I inhaled the air of new places, learned new languages, immersed myself in cultures that were once foreign to me, but now were becoming a part of who I was. These travels became a vital part of my inner growth. It wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a profound shift in my perception of the world. Photography became something more than just a hobby for me. It became a way to truly see the world. With every picture, I understood how much I had changed. What once seemed ordinary and familiar now caught my attention. I began to appreciate moments I had previously overlooked. The camera became my companion, my way of processing the world around me. I captured details that no one else seemed to notice: the light, the shadows, the textures, the emotions. Photography turned into a way to preserve beauty in its simplicity. I wasn't photographing for others. I was photographing for myself, preserving the moments that filled my life with genuine joy. Travel and photography opened up a whole new world for me, a world far broader than I could have imagined. I met people I would never have met before. There were no hidden agendas or manipulations in these encounters, no games. The people I met were searching for the same thing I was: real, honest connections and the desire for freedom. We could talk for hours, exchanging thoughts about life, dreams, and the true meaning of freedom. These conversations were liberating. I realized that in life, what truly matters is not things or achievements, but who you share your thoughts and soul with. I started to meet new friends, people with whom I shared my interests and passions, people who didn't expect anything from me but with whom I could be myself. I began to understand how much time I had wasted on those who didn't appreciate me, and how much I had missed out on by constantly trying to please others. Now I was surrounded by people who were on the same wavelength, people who were searching for not just comfort and safety but real freedom. And in time, I became truly independent. I was no longer dependent on others' opinions, on what others expected of me. I became my own master. My decisions were my own. My path was my own. And that brought me a tremendous sense of fulfillment. It was liberating. I no longer lived for others. I realized I had always placed other people's desires and needs above my own, thinking it was the right thing to do, thinking it was better for everyone. But I came to understand that I could live for myself, and that realization brought me true happiness. I enjoyed every moment of my freedom because I knew that now I was accountable only to my own desires and goals. I no longer had to sacrifice for those who didn't appreciate it. I didn't have to suppress my dreams to meet others' expectations. Now I lived for myself, and that gave me an incredible sense of contentment. I became more confident in my abilities and desires. I began trusting myself, and that confidence gave me true happiness. The freedom I felt was not just in the ability to travel or practice photography. The freedom lay in the fact that I could do what I wanted without worrying about how others would perceive it. I had become a free person, and that was the most important thing I could achieve. My life was no longer dependent on what others thought or wanted from me. Now I lived at my own pace, following my own goals and desires. And in the end, this feeling of freedom became my true happiness, the most valuable thing I had ever experienced. The path I had taken was not only long but also challenging. It was a journey that involved not just physical changes in my life but also a deep internal transformation. All those moments when I felt burdened by the expectations of others, when I thought I had to be someone for those around me, slowly faded into the past. I freed myself from obligations that once seemed so important, from all those people who never appreciated my efforts or my devotion. And now I enjoyed the solitude that I once found unbearable. It had become my friend, my ally on this new journey. Solitude ceased to be a heavy burden. It became part of me, part of my new world. I used to fear being alone with myself. I thought that if there was no one around to understand or support me, my life would lose its meaning. I feared the silence, feared that feeling of being alone, and perhaps that was one of my biggest fears. But now I understood that solitude was not emptiness. It was a chance to truly listen to myself. It was freedom from external noise, from people seeking my attention, from the pressure I had created for myself to please others. Now, I embraced solitude. I no longer felt that it had to be something frightening. It was my choice, my path, and I accepted it with gratitude. I learned to appreciate every moment I spent alone with myself. When I was by myself, I felt free. I could focus on my own desires and needs, not on what others wanted from me. It was liberation. I was no longer a slave to others' expectations and began to live for myself. I began to understand that there was nothing wrong with solitude. I wasn't a lonely person. I was a person who had learned to enjoy my own company. Every day brought new opportunities for self-discovery and realizing my true desires. And most importantly, I started to see that solitude wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new journey. It was an opportunity for me to be myself, without masks and pretenses. The freedom I felt wasn't just about traveling or changing my environment. It was freedom from everything that had held me back before. From all the obligations I had placed on myself for others. I didn't live for other people's needs anymore. I was ready to make my own path, and now it was mine. No one could dictate how I should live anymore. That was the most precious feeling I had ever experienced, being free from everything that constrained me. When I lived for others, I gave so much that I had forgotten about myself. I placed their needs above my own and believed it was the right thing to do. But now I understood that real life begins when you start putting yourself first. I no longer felt guilty for not living up to other people's expectations. I no longer tried to be what others wanted me to be. I started living for myself, and that brought me true happiness. My path wasn't easy. It was full of pain, doubts, and losses. But it was mine. And that was what made it valuable. I learned to appreciate every moment I spent on this journey. All the mistakes I made became important lessons. All the tough decisions I made became steps toward true freedom. I no longer looked back, no longer regretted what had been. I simply lived in the present, enjoying each new day. This was my path, my choice, and I was proud of it. Now I can say that the world and solitude became my source of strength. It wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a life where I was a free person. I enjoyed the fact that I no longer had to please anyone. I was who I always wanted to be, and that was incredibly important. This was my true happiness, being myself.